The land office clerk did not look up when he handed Elena Morozova the eviction notice on October 14th, 1873. His pen scratched across another document as though she were already gone, already erased from the records of the Gallatin Valley in Montana Territory. Elena stood perfectly still. The paper trembled slightly in her hands, but her face remained as composed as the mountains visible through the dirty window behind the clerk's desk. She had learned this stillness in Russia, where showing weakness invited wolves of every kind. Her husband Ivan's claim had reverted to the territorial government 6 months after his death from typhoid fever. The new claimant, a man she had never met, wanted possession before snowfall. She had 17 days to vacate the soddy they had carved into a hillside 2 years prior. 17 days to dismantle the life she and Ivan had built together. 17 days before winter closed its fist around the valley. She walked out of the land office into thin October sunlight. The main street of Bozeman Gulch stretched before her, muddy and rutted, lined with false-fronted buildings that proclaimed civilization in a land that remained fundamentally wild. A group of women stood outside the general store, their heads bent together in conversation. When they saw Elena, the conversation stopped. She heard it anyway. She always heard it. "That is the Morozova woman," one of them whispered, not quite quietly enough. First, her father died on the ship from Russia, collapsed on the deck 3 days before they reached New York, and she had to watch them slide his body into the ocean. Then her mother last winter, coughing blood until there was nothing left. Now the husband. Everyone who gets close to her dies. "Black widow," another voice agreed. "Bad luck follows that woman like a shadow. The Russians have a word for it. She is cursed." Elena kept walking. Her boots found the wooden boardwalk, then the muddy street again. She did not look back at the whispering women, did not acknowledge the way shopkeepers found reasons to step inside when she approached. 6 months of this. 6 months of being treated like a disease that might spread through proximity. She had $42 in coin. She had a team of oxen. She had no relatives within 800 miles. And in 17 days, she would have no home. The first hard freeze had already blackened the prairie grass. Winter was coming, and winter in the Gallatin Valley was not a season. It was a verdict. The valley ran 43 miles long between mountain ranges that funneled Arctic air straight down from Canada. Winter temperatures dropped to 38 degrees below zero in the valley bottom, and blizzards could last 4 to 6 days without breaking. Elena had survived 2 winters in the soddy with Ivan, but always with his labor to cut firewood, always with his body warmth beside her at night, always with his voice to push back against the howling darkness. Now there was only silence, and the whispers that filled it. She found Josiah Harwick outside his general store, supervising the unloading of a freight wagon. He was a lean man in his 50s, with gray threading through his beard and eyes that had seen enough frontier hardship to recognize it in others. When most of the settlement had turned their backs on Elena, Josiah had continued to serve her. Not with warmth exactly, but with the basic decency of commerce.
I am not asking for charity, Mr. Harwick.
"Mrs.
I am asking
Morozova,"
for bricks.
he tipped his hat.
The physics
"I heard
does
about
not
the
change
notice.
because
I
the
am
language
sorry.
does.
I need to buy supplies, Mr. Harwick, and I need to ask about bricks." He raised an eyebrow. "Bricks?" "Fire bricks, for building a stove. How many do you have?" Josiah pulled his coat tighter. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees that morning and showed no sign of climbing. "I have about 400 regular bricks in stock. Fire bricks I would have to freight from Fort Benton, and that is a 3-week round trip minimum." "Why would you need fire bricks anyway? You planning to build somewhere?" Elena looked at him directly. "I found a cabin, abandoned trapper place, 8 miles up the valley. I am going to claim it and survive the winter." "Alone?" The word carried weight. In frontier parlance, it meant impossible. A woman alone with no man's labor to cut wood, no man's strength to bank snow against walls, no man's presence to discourage the predators, both animal and human, that circled vulnerability. "Alone," Elena confirmed. Josiah shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Morozova, I respect your determination, but you need to be realistic. I have a cousin in Helena who runs a boarding house. She needs help, and it is work suitable for a woman. I can arrange passage on the next throw-out wagon." He was not being cruel. Elena understood this. Josiah had buried 3 families who had tried to overwinter without adequate preparation. He had seen what the valley did to hope and flesh and bone when the temperature dropped and the snow piled higher than door frames. A woman alone was simply a different kind of suicide. "The bricks," Elena said again. "Will you sell them to me on credit?" Josiah studied her face for a long moment. Something flickered in his expression, some internal calculation she could not read. Finally, he nodded. "I will sell you the bricks, but I want you to understand what you are attempting. You would need to burn through 8 to 12 cords of wood to survive a single winter in that cabin. That requires daily splitting and hauling. Even experienced male settlers struggle to keep ahead of that demand." "I know," Elena said. "That is why I am building a different kind of stove." She told him about the pech, the Russian oven, the massive brick structure that her grandfather had built in villages across the Novgorod region for 40 years. A stove that burned one fire in the morning and held heat all day and all night. A stove that used perhaps a quarter of the wood that conventional heating required. Josiah listened without interrupting. When she finished, he rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I have never heard of such a thing. A stove that holds heat for 24 hours on one firing? That sounds like wishful thinking, Mrs. Morozova. Heat dissipates. That is basic physics." "Not physics, thermal mass." Elena pulled a scrap of paper from her pocket and began sketching. "The bricks absorb the heat and release it slowly. The smoke travels through many channels before exiting, surrendering heat to the masonry. My grandfather built these stoves for 40 years. They work." "Your grandfather was in Russia. This is Montana. Cold is cold, Mr. Harwick. The physics does not change because the language does." Josiah looked at the sketch, then at Elena's face. Whatever he saw there made him pause. He set down the ledger he had been holding and spoke in a lower voice. "Mrs. Morozova, I will tell you something I have not told anyone else in this town. My daughter Cordelia is in trouble, the kind of trouble that makes respectable people cross the street, same as they do with you." Elena waited. "No husband, but a child coming before summer." Josiah's voice was steady, but his eyes were not. "I have watched this town decide who deserves help and who deserves to be forgotten. I have watched them call you cursed because it is easier than admitting they are afraid. I will not be part of that. Not anymore." He closed the ledger with a snap. 400 bricks on credit. "You can pay me back when you prove me wrong. Prove them all wrong, and maybe, when you do, my Cordelia will..."
In Russia, we have a saying, "A warm house is a prayer God hears." I am building a warm house. This is my prayer, Reverend.
"Have a chance too." Elena took the paper back and folded it carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Harwick. I will prove you wrong." She was halfway down the boardwalk when his voice stopped her. "Mrs. Morozova, why did you come to me? Everyone else in town crosses the street when they see you coming. Why did you think I would help?" Elena turned back. The afternoon light caught her face, illuminating features that had been weathered by grief and hardship into something stronger than beauty. Strong bones, dark eyes that held depths of experience that most American women her age would never know. "Because you do not believe in curses, Mr. Harwick. You believe in mathematics, and the mathematics says I need 400 bricks." She walked away before he could respond, but she heard him laugh once, short in surprise. It was the first laughter that had been directed at her, rather than about her, in 6 months. That night, Elena lay in the sadi that was no longer hers, listening to the wind pick at the grass roof. In 17 days, strangers would sleep here. They would never know about the corner where Ivan had carved their initials into the support beam. They would never know about the spot by the door where Elena had stood watching for his return every evening, counting the minutes until his shape appeared on the horizon. She closed her eyes and let herself travel backward. Not to the Sadi, but further, across an ocean and half a continent. Back to a village outside Novgorod, where snow fell for 7 months of the year, and the cold made Montana seem temperate. Her grandfather Alexei had been a pechnik, a master stove builder. In her memory, he was always covered in brick dust, his hands rough as tree bark, his eyes bright with the particular satisfaction of a craftsman who understood his materials. "Come, little one," he he would say, by lifting her onto his shoulders so she could see into the firebox he was constructing. Tell me what you see. Bricks, she would answer. Just bricks, Dedushka. Not just bricks, possibilities. Each brick holds heat. Each channel guides smoke. Together, they become a system, a machine for turning wood into warmth. But only if you understand how they talk to each other. She had watched him build 17 stoves before she turned 12. She had learned to mix mortar, to judge the moisture content of clay, to calculate the length of flue paths needed for maximum heat extraction. She had learned because learning was what you did when you were the granddaughter of Alexei Morozov, and because there was no son to inherit his knowledge. Her grandfather had his own history with whispers and isolation. His wife and 2 sons had died in the famine of 1848, and the village had murmured that he was marked by God for some unknown sin. He had responded by building a stove for the poorest family in the village, a family with 6 children and a father too sick to work. That winter, while other families burned through their wood supplies and shivered in inadequate houses, the poor family stayed warm. The next year, Alexei built 3 more stoves. The year after that, 7. By the time Elena was born, no one remembered the whispers about curses. They only remembered the warmth. They will call you names, her grandfather had told her once, when she was old enough to understand. When you are alone, when you have no one to protect you, they will call you cursed and unlucky and worse. But knowledge, little one, knowledge they cannot take. What lives in your hands and your head, that belongs to you forever. Build for them. Build until they cannot deny what you are. Elena opened her eyes. The wind had died down, and the soddy was silent except for the creak of settling earth. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, and another answered. 17 days, 400 bricks, 1 woman who refused to die on schedule. She would build. The abandoned trapper cabin sat 8 miles up the valley, tucked against a hillside that offered some protection from the prevailing winds. Elena found it on October 16th after a full day of searching, following rumors and half-remembered directions from the few people willing to speak to her. The cabin was worse than she had hoped and better than she had feared. It measured 14 feet by 16 feet, built from logs that had been poorly chinked and never properly maintained. Gaps between the logs let daylight through in dozens of places. The window openings had no glass, just stretched canvas that had rotted in places. The door hung crooked on leather hinges, and the stone fireplace in the corner had collapsed into a pile of rubble that blocked a quarter of the floor space. But the roof was intact, the floor was solid, and the location was perfect, positioned to catch morning sun while being sheltered from the worst of the north wind. Elena filed a squatter's claim at the land office that afternoon. The clerk who had handed her the eviction notice 2 days earlier looked at her as though she had lost her mind. You understand that claim gives you no legal protection until you have improved the property, he said. Anyone can contest it. I understand. And you understand that the previous occupant died in that cabin last winter. Froze to death when his firewood ran out during a blizzard. I understand. The clerk shrugged and stamped her paperwork. In his experience, the territory would resolve this.
My grandfather did not know physics. He just knew what worked. 40 years of building told him what works.
Particular claim within the first week of December, when the widow Morozova joined the long list of optimists who had underestimated Montana winters. Elena moved into the cabin on October 18th with her oxen, her $42, and the knowledge her grandfather had given her. She also brought a collection of tools she had gathered from the soddy, a shovel, a pickaxe, a hammer, a saw, and a collection of wooden forms she had built for making bricks. The first task was the clay. She found it along the creek bank a quarter mile from the cabin. Good clay, dense and smooth, with enough natural sand content that it would not need much amendment. She dug until her shoulders burned and her hands blistered, filling bucket after bucket and hauling them back to the cabin on a makeshift sledge. The work had a rhythm to it. Dig, haul, dump, return. Each bucket was perhaps 30 pounds. Each trip was a quarter mile. She made 40 trips that first day and fell asleep without eating dinner. her muscles screaming protests she was too exhausted to hear. On the 19th, she began building forms. Scrap lumber from the collapsed fireplace became molds for bricks measuring 9 inches by 4 inches by 3 inches. She mixed clay with chopped grass for binding, packed it into the forms, and turned out bricks to cure under canvas tarps. By October 23rd, she had 200 sun-dried clay bricks curing and had purchased all 400 of Josiah's stock bricks on credit. The commercial fire bricks would form the firebox lining and the inner flue channels where temperatures would exceed 800 degrees. Her handmade clay bricks would form the outer mass, where they only needed to hold heat rather than withstand direct flame. She had also torn out the cabin's failed stone fireplace and excavated a foundation pit 4 feet deep in the corner where 2 walls met. The stove would be massive, 7 feet long by 4 feet deep, rising 6 feet before tapering to the chimney. It would weigh approximately 4,000 pounds when complete. It would occupy nearly a quarter of the cabin's floor space, and it would keep her alive. Reverend Ezekiel Crane arrived on October 24th, picking his way through the mud on a gray mare that looked as disapproving as its rider. He was a thin man with a thin voice, and he had established a Methodist mission in the valley 3 years earlier. He considered it his duty to counsel those who had strayed from practical wisdom into the wilderness of pride. "Sister Morozova," he said, dismounting with the careful movements of a man who had never quite mastered horsemanship, "I have heard about your endeavor. I felt called to speak with you." Elena did not stop mixing mortar. She had learned that stopping encouraged visitors to stay longer. "I admire your industry," the Reverend continued, "but this endeavor seems imprudent. The Christian duty is to accept one's limitations and seek appropriate help. Pride can be a mortal danger in circumstances like these." Elena measured out sand and added it to her clay mixture. "You think it is pride to keep myself warm, Reverend? I think it is pride to reject wisdom from those with more experience in this land. Brother Harwick has offered to arrange employment in Helena. Taking it is not failure, it is wisdom." Elena finally looked up. Her hands were gray with clay, her dress was stained beyond recovery, and her hair had escaped its pins in a dozen places. She looked nothing like a respectable widow, and everything like a woman who had chosen work over weeping. "In Russia," she said, "we have a saying, 'A warm house is a prayer God hears.' I am building a warm house. This is my prayer." The Reverend frowned. "God helps those who help themselves, certainly, but he also expects us to recognize when we are overmatched. Then I will let him tell me when I am overmatched. Until then, I will build." Reverend Crane left with the expression of a man who had done his duty and washed his hands of the consequences. Elena returned to her mortar, and the conversation was over. But she noticed that he had looked at her work with something that might have been curiosity beneath the disapproval. The structure taking shape in the corner of her cabin was unlike anything in the valley. It was not American. It was not efficient in the way Americans understood efficiency, which meant fast and portable and easily replaced. It was Russian, and it was designed for a kind of cold that Montana settlers had not yet learned to respect. Thaddeus Whitmore arrived 3 days later, drawn by the same curiosity that had flickered in the Reverend's eyes. Thaddeus had served as a civilian scout for the Army before taking a homestead claim in the valley. He knew cold weather and survival, and he knew physics. When Josiah mentioned Elena's plans at the saloon, Thaddeus had shaken his head. "A brick stove that holds heat all day? That violates basic thermodynamics. Heat dissipates. You need constant fuel. Russians or not, you cannot change the laws of physics with bricks." But he came to see it anyway, and what he found surprised him. The structure was half finished now, rising 4 feet from its foundation. The firebox sat low, about 18 inches off the floor, measuring 3 feet wide by 2 feet deep. Above and around it, Lena was constructing a maze of internal channels through the brick mass. The paths twisted and turned, rose and fell, forcing smoke through 43 feet of horizontal and vertical passages before reaching the chimney exit. "The engineering is actually clever," Thaddeus admitted, tracing the channel pattern with his finger. "Each turn creates turbulence. Turbulence increases contact time between hot gas and brick surface. Heat transfer is a function of contact time, and surface area. You have maximized both. My grandfather did not know physics, Elena said. He just knew what worked. 40 years of building told him what works. That is how the best engineering happens. Empirical testing over generations. Thaddeus studied the structure more carefully. The mass stores heat because brick has low thermal conductivity, slow release rather than quick radiation. He straightened and looked at Elena with new respect. Your grandfather was doing thermal engineering before anyone called it that. Will it work here, in Montana? Thaddeus considered the question carefully. He was not a man who offered false hope. In theory, yes, the physics is sound, but theory and practice diverge in extreme conditions. When it is 30 below with 50 miles
Please! My husband is injured! We have no more wood! The children will die! Please, I know
winds, we will see if your grandfather's engineering holds. He came back the next day, and the next, not to help exactly, but to observe and document. He brought paper and pencil and began making technical drawings of the flue paths, calculating heat transfer coefficients and thermal mass requirements. Thaddeus Whitmore was a skeptic, but he was an honest skeptic. If Elena's stove worked, he wanted to understand why. I still think you will freeze, he told her on the 30th. But if you do not freeze, I want to know exactly how. Elena appreciated his honesty. It was cleaner than the pity others offered, and more useful than the condemnation of those who had already written her obituary in their minds. The night of October 25th, Elena woke to destruction. She had been sleeping in the corner of the cabin farthest from the construction, wrapped in blankets against the cold that crept through every gap in the walls. The sound that woke her was subtle, a scraping and cracking that did not belong to wind or settling logs. By the time she lit a candle, the damage was done. 50 of her sun-dried bricks had been smashed. They lay in fragments on the frozen ground, 2 weeks of work destroyed in minutes. The clay had been carefully mixed, carefully formed, carefully cured. Now it was rubble. Elena stood in the candlelight, looking at the destruction, and felt something cold settle in her chest. This was not weather. This was not accident. Someone had come in the night and deliberately destroyed her work. She thought about the whispers in town, black widow, cursed woman. Bad luck follows her like a shadow. Someone had decided to help the curse along. She did not cry. She had used up her tears in the weeks after Ivan's death, spent them all in the privacy of the soddy where no one could see her weakness. Now she simply calculated. 50 bricks. 2 weeks of curing time. She could not afford to lose 2 weeks. She would have to work faster. On October 28th, it happened again. This time someone had poured water over the bricks that were still curing. The water had frozen overnight, expanding and cracking the clay. Another 30 bricks ruined. Elena examined the footprints in the frost. Small boots. A child's boots, perhaps. The tracks led toward the creek and disappeared on the rocky bank. She told no one. What would be the point? The town already believed she was cursed. Vandalism would only confirm their suspicions. And she could not afford the time it would take to pursue justice that would never come. Instead, she worked longer hours. She mixed more clay, built more forms, produced more bricks. She moved the curing operation inside the cabin, sacrificing floor space for security. She slept later, waking at every sound, a kitchen knife within reach. The vandal did not return, but the message had been received. Someone wanted her to fail. Someone wanted the curse to win. Elena built faster. By November 4th, the structure was complete except for the chimney cap. She had worked 12 to 14 hours daily for 17 days, mixing mortar, laying bricks, checking flue passages with a candle to ensure proper draw. Her hands were cracked and bleeding. Her back had developed a permanent ache, but the stove stood in the corner of her cabin like a promise made solid. 7 feet long, 4 feet deep, 6 feet high before the chimney taper. 4,000 pounds of brick and clay and mortar. Built by a woman who refused to die on schedule. Tomorrow, she would fire it for the first time. Tomorrow, she would find out if her grandfather's engineering could survive translation across an ocean and half a continent. Tomorrow, everything would change. Elena woke before dawn on November 5th. The temperature had dropped to 19 degrees overnight, cold enough that her breath formed clouds in the cabin's darkness. She lay still for a moment, gathering courage for what came next. The first firing of a Russian stove was critical. If the mortar had been mixed wrong, the heat would crack it. If the flue channels had been aligned poorly, the smoke would back up into the room. If the firebox was improperly sized, the fire would not burn hot enough to heat the mass. 100 things could go wrong, and any one of them could mean the difference between survival and death. She built the fire carefully. Pine kindling first, arranged in a precise lattice that would allow maximum airflow. Then larger pieces as split thin for quick combustion. The goal was heat, not duration. She needed to get the firebox temperature above 900 degrees to properly transfer energy to the surrounding mass. She lit the kindling and stepped back. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. The fire crackled and grew, consuming wood with the hungry efficiency of good combustion. Smoke rose toward the flue entrance and disappeared into the dark channel she had built. Then the smoke stopped rising. It poured back into the room instead, thick and choking, filling the cabin with a gray haze that burned her eyes and seared her lungs. Elena stumbled toward the door, coughing, her eyes streaming tears. She flung the door open and stood in the cold morning air, watching smoke billow from the cabin as though the building itself were on fire. The stove had failed. She did not know how long she stood there. Long enough for the sun to clear the eastern peaks. Long enough for her breathing to slow and her tears to dry up. Long enough for Thaddeus Whitmore to appear on his morning rounds, observe the smoke, and ride over to investigate. He found her sitting on a stump outside the cabin, her face streaked with soot and dried tears, her hands hanging loose between her knees. The smoke had mostly cleared by then, escaping through the open door and the gaps in the walls. "It did not work," she said. Her voice was flat, emptied of emotion. Thaddeus dismounted and walked past her into the cabin. She heard him moving around inside, examining the stove, running his hands along the flue paths. When he emerged, his expression was thoughtful rather than pitying. "The structure is sound," he said. "The mortar held. The channels are clear. There is no structural failure." The smoke came back, into the room, not up the chimney. Thaddeus nodded slowly. "That is not a design flaw. That is a cold chimney problem." Elena looked up. "Cold chimney?" "The flue is 43 feet long. When you lit the fire, that entire length was filled with cold air, heavier than the warm air from the combustion. The warm smoke could not push through it, so it came back the easy way into the room." "Then the design is wrong." "No, the design is right for a climate where the stove runs continuously or where you can light a small preliminary fire to warm the chimney before the main burn." Thaddeus crouched beside her, meeting her eyes. "Your grandfather's stoves worked in Russia because the houses were kept warm year-round. The chimneys never got truly cold. Here, starting from frozen, you need to prime the system." Elena processed this information. A small fire in the chimney itself before the main fire. Exactly. Paper or small kindling burned in the clean-out opening at the chimney base. Warm the air column first, create an upward draft, then light the main fire. The warm chimney will pull the smoke up instead of letting it fall back. She stood. Her legs were stiff from sitting in the cold, and her clothes still reeked of smoke. But something had shifted in her chest. The failure was not fatal. It was fixable. "Will you show me?" Thaddeus showed her. They built a small fire of paper scraps in the clean-out opening at the chimney base, letting it burn for 15 minutes until the column of air in the flue had warmed enough to rise. Then Elena rebuilt the main fire in the firebox and lit it. This time, the smoke rose. It climbed through the first channel, turned at the first baffle, descended through the second channel, rose again through the third. 43 feet of labyrinthine passage, extracting heat at every turn, before the smoke emerged from the chimney cap as a thin...
Build for them. Build until they cannot deny what you are. Knowledge lives in your hands and your head, and that belongs to you forever.
...white stream against the cold blue sky. Within an hour, the exterior bricks were warm to the touch. Within 3 hours, they were hot enough that Elena could not keep her hand on them for more than a few seconds. The cabin temperature had risen from 34 degrees to 58 degrees and continued climbing. At sunset, she let the fire die completely. She sealed the damper and watched the flames dwindle to embers, then ash. The firebox went dark, but the bricks continued radiating heat. At midnight, the cabin was still 52 degrees. At dawn, with outside temperatures at 12 degrees, the interior had dropped only to 49. One fire, 2 hours of burning, 18 hours of heat. Her grandfather's engineering had survived translation. Elena stood alone in the cabin, 4,000 pounds of brick rising in the corner, like a promise she had made to herself. The stove worked. The mathematics held. The knowledge that had crossed an ocean and half a continent had proven itself in conditions that would have killed anyone without preparation. But winter had not truly arrived yet. The real test was still coming. 17 days, 400 bricks, one woman against a Montana winter. If you want to know what happened when the real storm came, when the temperature dropped to 38 below and the wind howled for 10 days without stopping, stay with me. But first, take a moment to subscribe and tap that notification bell. This is not just a story about stoves. This is a story about what happens when the world tells you something cannot be done and you build it anyway. Josiah Harwick came by on November 7th to see the results for himself. He put his hand on the bricks and felt heat that would have required a roaring cast iron stove to produce. The firebox contained nothing but cold ash. "How long since you burned wood?" he asked. "Yesterday morning, one fire, 2 hours burning, still warm now." Josiah did the math. A conventional stove would have burned wood continuously for the same heat. If her system actually worked as demonstrated, she would use 70 to 75% less fuel over a winter. That was the difference between possible and impossible for a woman working alone. He still had doubts about performance in extreme cold, but he could not deny what his hand felt. The widow Morozova had built something the valley had never seen. Whether it would keep her alive through a Montana winter remained to be proven. But for the first time, Josiah allowed himself to consider the possibility that he might be wrong about her chances. The first serious test came on November 19th when a cold front pushed through from Canada. Temperature dropped to 6 degrees by afternoon and continued falling. By midnight, it was 4 degrees below zero. Elena had prepared carefully. She had spent the intervening weeks reinforcing the cabin's walls with moss and clay chinking, replacing the rotted canvas window coverings with proper oiled paper, and stockpiling wood inside the cabin where weather could not reach it. She had 2 cords of split pine stacked against the interior walls and another cord under a tarp lean-to outside. She fired the stove at 5 in the morning, loading the firebox with split pine and letting it burn hot for 90 minutes. The temperature peaked above 900 degrees in the firebox, transferring enormous amounts of energy to the surrounding mass. Then she sealed the damper and let the fire die. By 7 in the morning, the cabin was 63 degrees. By noon, with outside temperatures holding at 8 below, the interior had dropped only to 59. By midnight at 9 below outside, the cabin held at 51 degrees. She slept under 2 wool blankets, warm and dry, while the wind howled outside and the cold crept across the valley. In the morning, she would fire the stove again, another 2 hours of burning, another 18 hours of heat. The mathematics worked. The physics held. The grandfather's engineering proved itself in conditions that would have killed dozens of less prepared settlers. Elena had outwitted winter. Now she just had to survive it. The weeks passed. November gave way to December. The temperature dropped lower, recovered slightly, dropped again. Elena developed a routine that governed her days with the precision of ritual. Wake before dawn, prime the chimney with paper, light the main fire, let it burn hot for 2 hours, seal the damper, spend the day on other tasks, mending clothes, preparing food, maintaining the cabin. Sleep warm. Christmas came and went. Elena spent it alone in the cabin, listening to the wind and thinking about Ivan. They had planned to have children. They had talked about building a proper house in the spring, something with glass windows and a wooden floor. They had dreamed together about a future that would never arrive. But she was alive, and as long as she was alive, she could build new dreams. January arrived with teeth. The blizzard started on January 14th, 1874. Elena had been watching the sky for days, reading the signs her grandfather had taught her. The peculiar yellow cast to the western clouds, the way the wind shifted from northwest to true north, bringing the smell of ice from the Canadian peaks, the unusual silence of the birds, as though every living creature knew what was coming and had gone to ground. She spent the 12th and 13th hauling extra wood inside, stacking it against every wall until the cabin resembled a lumber storage shed with a stove in the corner. She melted snow for water and filled every container she owned. She checked the damper in the clean-out door, in the mortar joints she had repaired after the first hard freeze. When the snow began falling on the morning of the 14th, she was ready. Or she thought she was. The snow started light, scattered flakes that danced in the wind like ashes from a distant fire. By noon, it was falling steadily. By evening, the wind had increased to 40 miles per hour, driving snow horizontally across the valley until the cabin became invisible from 50 feet away. Temperature dropped through the day and continued dropping through the night. 12 below, 18 below, 21 below by the second morning. Elena fired the stove at dawn. I'm on dawn, letting it burn hot for 2 hours before sealing the damper. The familiar routine had become automatic over the past 3 months. Wood, fire, heat, weight. The mathematics of survival reduced to simple repetition. But the blizzard had its own mathematics. By the second afternoon, the cabin was completely drifted over on the north and east sides. Snow packed against the walls in drifts that reached the roofline. The door would not open against the weight. Elena had to dig a tunnel through the drift to create an exit, working with a shovel in temperatures that froze the sweat on her face before she could wipe it away. The wind screamed around the cabin walls, finding every gap in the chinking that she had missed in her preparations. Cold crept in through cracks she could not see, stealing heat faster than the stove could replace it. On the third day, the temperature outside reached 34 degrees below zero. The blizzard showed no signs of stopping. Elena sat by the stove with her hands pressed against the warm bricks, listening to the wind tear at the world outside. The cabin temperature had dropped to 52 degrees, cooler than she liked, but survivable. The wood supply was holding. The stove was performing exactly as designed. But fear had found its way inside anyway. She thought about the settlers scattered across the valley, dozens of families in cabins and soddies, burning through wood supplies that had seemed adequate in November. She thought about the mathematics of conventional heating, 8 to 12 cords for a winter, and wondered how many would fall short. She thought about dying alone in a cabin that no one would check for days after the storm passed. Then she pushed the fire aside and added wood to the fire. There would be time for fear when survival was no longer the priority. The fourth day brought a brief lull in the wind. The temperature held at 29 below, but the snow stopped falling and visibility improved to a few hundred yards. Elena dug out from the cabin and assessed her situation. The lean-to that sheltered her exterior wood supply had collapsed under the weight of drifted snow. She could see the edge of the tarp, but the wood itself was buried under 6 feet of packed white. Digging it out would require hours of work in deadly cold with no guarantee of success. She did the math. She had 12 days of interior wood remaining at her current burn rate. If the blizzard continued for another week, she would be fine. If it lasted longer, she would need to start rationing, which meant colder cabin temperatures and increased risk of illness. The conventional math said a blizzard this severe could last 4 to 6 days. She was already on day 4 with no sign of the weather breaking permanently. The lull lasted 2 hours. Then the wind returned with renewed violence, driving fresh snow before it, and Elena retreated inside to wait. She did not know that the lull had been long enough for others to make desperate decisions. Henrik Bergstrom's cabin sat 2 miles east of Elena's, closer to the valley floor and more exposed to the wind. Henrik was a sawmill man, Swedish by birth, and he understood wood and weather as well as anyone in the territory. He had calculated his winter fuel supply with professional precision. He had not calculated for a 10-day blizzard. On the 4th day, with the wind briefly calm, Henrik realized that his accessible wood supply would not last through another week of storm. His main wood pile was 30 yards from the cabin, buried under a drift he estimated at 10 feet deep. The wood inside would last perhaps 2 more days of continuous burning. His wife Ingrid had given birth to their fourth child in December. The infant was 6 weeks old, still fragile, still vulnerable to cold in ways that would kill within hours if the cabin temperature dropped. Henrik decided to try for the main woodpile during the lull. He made it 20 yards before the wind returned. He was caught in the open when a gust of 60 miles per hour drove ice crystals into his exposed face like needles. He turned back, disoriented, and spent precious minutes finding the cabin door while his left hand and face froze. When Ingrid pulled him inside, his left hand was white and hard as marble. His face had frozen patches on both cheeks and his nose. He had retrieved no wood. That night, they burned a chair. The next night, the table. On the 6th day of the storm, Henrik sat in his cabin with his wife and 4 children, surrounded by the wreckage of furniture they had spent 2 years building, and knew that mathematics had finally caught up with him. 2 days of fuel remained. The blizzard continued unabated. Even if the storm broke tomorrow, it would take days to dig out and reach help. He had failed them all. Ingrid made the decision on the evening of the 6th day. She wrapped the baby in every blanket they owned, bundled the older children, and told Henrik she was going to find help. "The Morozova woman," she said. "Her cabin is 2 miles west. She has that strange stove that burns little wood. If she has fuel to spare, she might share it. She will not help us." Henrik's voice was hollow with pain and fever from his frostbitten hand. "You told everyone she was cursed. You told the children to stay away from her. You refused to lend her a shovel when she asked." Ingrid's face hardened with determination that only a mother protecting her children can summon. "Then I will beg, I will crawl, I will do whatever it takes, but I will not watch my children freeze while there is any chance at all." She left the older children with Henrik and set out into the storm with the baby pressed against her chest. The wind hit her like a fist. The cold sank through every layer of clothing she wore. She could not see more than 10 feet in any direction, but she knew the direction. West, always west, 2 miles to the cabin of the cursed woman who might be her children's only hope. If you have been following Elena's journey and feeling the weight of what she has endured, this is where I ask you to pause for just a moment. If this story has touched something in you, if you have ever been judged unfairly or had to prove yourself against impossible odds, please take a second to hit the like button. It helps this channel reach others who need to hear that determination can overcome even the coldest winters. Now let me tell you what happened next. Elena heard the pounding on her door at just past 8 in the evening. The sound barely penetrated the howl of the wind, a faint rhythmic thumping that could have been a branch or a piece of debris driven against the cabin wall. But something made her check. She opened the door to find Ingrid Bergstrom standing in the drift, her face white with frost, her arms wrapped around a bundle that cried weakly against the wind. Behind her, visible only as shadows in the driving snow, stood 3 children clinging to each other against the cold. Elena had met Ingrid once 3 months earlier. She had asked to borrow a shovel. Ingrid had refused, had stepped back from her door as though Elena carried plague. "That woman is bad luck," Ingrid had said, loud enough for Elena to hear. "Keep away from her children. Death follows that one." Now Ingrid stood on Elena's doorstep with death following close behind her, blue-lipped and shivering, her children's faces raw with windburn. "Please." The word came out as a croak, barely audible above the storm. "My husband is injured. We have no more wood. The children will die. Please, I know I have no right to ask. I know what I said about you, but please." This is the moment everything changes. Elena stands at her door with a choice that will define not just her survival, but her legacy. The woman outside called her cursed. The children were taught to fear her. Every instinct says to turn away, to let the storm deliver the justice that cruelty deserves. But Elena Morozova is not a woman who lets the world make her choices. She looked at the woman who had called her cursed. She looked at the children who had been taught to fear her. She looked at the infant whose cries were growing weaker as the cold sapped its tiny strength. She thought about all the nights she had spent alone in this cabin, building something everyone said was impossible, enduring whispers and sabotage and isolation because the valley had decided she was bad luck. Then she opened the door wider. Bring them inside, quickly, before they freeze. The rescue took 2 trips. Elena brought the children in first, then went back out into the storm with Ingrid to retrieve Henrik from the Bergstrom cabin. They found him barely conscious, his frostbitten hands swollen and discolored, his fever high enough that he did not seem to know where he was. They carried him between them, staggering through drifts that reached their waists, following Elena's lifeline of rope she had strung between trees during the lull. Without that rope, they would never have found their way back. By midnight, 7 people occupied Elena's 14 by 16-foot cabin. Henrik lay on a pallet near the stove, his hand packed in snow to draw out the deep cold before it could be warmed gradually. Ingrid sat beside him, nursing the baby, while tears rolled silently down her cheeks. The 3 older children huddled together against the far wall, exhausted and frightened but no longer freezing. Elena calculated the new mathematics. 7 people, 1 stove. A wood supply that had been adequate for 1 was now strained for 7. The extra body heat would help maintain temperature, but she would need to fire the stove more frequently to compensate for the constant opening and closing of the door. 6 days of wood at the new burn rate, maybe 7 if she was careful. The blizzard continued to howl outside. She did not tell the Bergstroms about her calculations. There was no point in adding fear to their already overwhelming burden. Instead, she showed the oldest child, a boy of 12 named Sven, how to tend the fire and maintain the damper settings. She showed Ingrid how to prepare the simple meals that could be cooked on the stove's surface. She made everyone useful because usefulness was its own kind of warmth. On the 7th day of the storm, Sven approached Elena while his mother slept. The boy was tall for 12, with his father's Swedish coloring and his mother's stubborn jaw. He had been watching Elena work for 2 days, following her movements with an attention that seemed like more than simple curiosity. "Mrs. Morozova," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." Elena continued stacking wood. "Yes?" "The bricks, your bricks that got smashed back in October, and the water that someone poured on them." He swallowed hard. "That was me." Elena stopped moving. She turned to look at the boy, whose face had gone pale with the confession. "My mother said you were cursed. She said bad luck followed you, and that if anyone helped you, the bad luck would spread to them. I thought if your stove did not work, you would leave, and then the curse would leave too. I was trying to protect my family." Elena remembered those nights, the shock of finding her work destroyed, the bitter cold of starting over when she had no time to spare, the knowledge that someone wanted her to fail badly enough to sneak into her camp and sabotage her efforts. She had imagined an adult enemy, someone who hated her for her foreignness or feared her for her independence. She had not imagined a frightened boy trying to protect his family from an imaginary curse. "You understand now that there is no curse," she said quietly. Sven nodded miserably. "You saved us. My mother called you evil, and you saved us anyway. You had every reason to leave us in the storm, and you did not." "People are not curses," Elena said. "Curses are stories we tell to explain things we do not understand. When we are afraid, we look for someone to blame. Your mother was afraid. You were afraid. Fear makes us cruel sometimes, but cruelty does not have to be permanent." "I am sorry, I am so sorry." "I know." Elena handed him a piece of wood. "Put this in the firebox. Not too much. We need the fire hot, not large. Let me show you the difference." She spent the next hour teaching Sven how the stove worked, the physics of thermal mass, the chemistry of efficient combustion, the engineering of flue paths designed to extract maximum heat from minimum fuel. He listened with the desperate attention of a boy who needed to make amends, and something else emerged too. Understanding. Interest. The beginning of respect for knowledge that had seemed like witchcraft and now revealed itself as practical wisdom. "My grandfather taught me," Elena said, "in Russia, when I was not much older than you. He said that knowledge is the one thing no one can take from you. Buildings can burn, money can be stolen, people can be taken away. But what you know, what lives in your hands and your head, that belongs to you forever. Will you teach me more?" Elena looked at the barn who had tried to destroy her work and now sat beside her, asking to learn how to build it. She thought about her grandfather in Novgorod, teaching a girl in a society that did not value girls' knowledge. She thought about knowledge crossing borders and generations, adapting to new landscapes and new needs. Yes, she said, I will teach you more. On the eighth day, the wind shifted to the northwest and increased. The cabin shook with gusts that Elena estimated at 60 miles per hour. Temperature outside dropped to 38 degrees below zero. Henrik's fever broke, but his hand showed the blackening that meant dead tissue. He would lose at least 2 fingers, probably more. The pain was constant, and Elena had nothing to give him for it except willow bark tea and distraction. She told him about her grandfather's stoves, about building in Novgorod and watching the village transform from scattered cold houses to a community of warmth, about crossing the ocean with her parents and her new husband, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and knowledge in their heads. She told him about Ivan, how they had met in New York, 2 immigrants sharing a language and a dream, how they had come west chasing land and opportunity, how he had died in her arms while typhoid burned through him, and how she had spent the next 6 months learning what it meant to be truly alone. Henrik listened because listening kept his mind off the pain. But something changed in his expression as she talked. The suspicion that had been there when they first arrived, the lingering belief that perhaps the curse was real after all, gradually faded. In its place came something that looked like respect. I am a sawmill man, he said during a lull in her narrative. I know wood and I know tools. I have built houses and barns and furniture. But I have never seen anything like your stove. It is beyond anything I understood about heating. It is not beyond understanding. It is just different understanding. In America, you have much wood and little time. Your stoves are designed for that. Fast to build, easy to move. In Russia, we had less wood and more cold. Our stoves are designed for that instead. Could I build one if I had the knowledge? Elena looked at his bandaged hand. You will need help. But yes, the principles are not complicated. Mass, heat, temov. Channel the smoke to extract the heat before it escapes. Let the mass store the heat and release it slowly. Any person can build this if they understand why each part matters. Henrik nodded slowly. When this storm breaks, I would like to learn. When this storm breaks, I will teach you. The storm broke on the morning of the 10th day. Elena woke to silence. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the wind had stopped. Sunlight filtered through the oiled paper window coverings, golden and clean, illuminating a cabin full of sleeping forms. She rose carefully and made her way to the door. It resisted at first, packed against drifts that had formed in the night's final hours. She put her shoulder to it and pushed until it gave way, spilling her out into a world transformed. Snow covered everything. Drifts 15 to 20 feet high had reshaped the landscape into something alien and beautiful. The valley was silent except for the occasional crack of ice settling and the distant call of a crow. Elena stood in the doorway and breathed air that burned her lungs with its purity. She was alive. The Bergstroms were alive. Whatever had been destroyed or lost during the blizzard, these 7 people had survived. She had 3 days of wood remaining. It had been enough. Josiah Harwick organized the count on the 3rd day after the storm. The settlers emerged from their various shelters, blinking in the brilliant sunlight that now seemed almost cruel after so many days of darkness. They gathered at the general store, a ragged collection of survivors comparing notes on damage and loss. The news came in pieces. The Hendersons, a family of 4 who had claimed land near the valley floor, had run out of fuel on day 6. By the time anyone reached them, 2 children and their mother had frozen to death. The father survived but would never be the same. The elderly couple, the Petersons, who had settled near the creek, had inadequate shelter. Their cabin roof had collapsed under the weight of snow. They were found together in bed, frozen in each other's arms. 2 men had died trying to reach neighbors for help. One had made it halfway before the wind brought him down. The other had left his cabin on day 4 and was found 300 yards away, so covered in snow that he looked like a natural feature of the landscape. In total, 11 people dead in a 100-mile radius. 11 lives ended by a blizzard that had lasted exactly 10 days. and 7 people alive in a 14 by 16-foot cabin heated by a stove that everyone had said was impossible. The story spread through the valley like wildfire in spring. The widow Morozova, the cursed woman, the black widow that everyone avoided, had not only survived but had saved an entire family. Henrik Bergstrom, his hand still bandaged and his face still bearing the scars of frostbite, told everyone who would listen about the stove that burned 1 fire a day, the stove that had kept 7 people warm through the worst blizzard anyone could remember. Thaddeus Whitmore wrote a letter to the territorial newspaper. He included technical drawings he had made during his observations in November, calculations of fuel efficiency, and a detailed account of the blizzard survival. He was careful to note that Elena's design achieved approximately 73% fuel reduction compared to conventional cast iron stoves. This efficiency differential meant survival versus death, he wrote. Mrs. Morozova's Russian masonry heater represents engineering knowledge that American settlers would benefit from adopting. The letter was published in February. By March, 17 homesteaders in the Gallatin Valley had approached Elena about building similar stoves. She charged $12 per stove for her consulting and labor. It was enough to pay off her debts and establish legitimate claim to the cabin. It was enough to transform her from charity case to respected craftsman. It was enough to prove that knowledge, properly applied, could overcome any label that fear invented. Reverend Ezekiel Crane requested to speak at the first Sunday service after the storm. The congregation gathered in the meeting house, survivors of the worst winter anyone could remember, still wearing black for the 11 who had not survived. The Reverend stood before them with his thin face and thin voice and surprised everyone. "I owe this congregation an apology," he began, "and more than this congregation, I owe Mrs. Morozova an apology." A murmur rippled through the assembled settlers. Apologies from preachers were rare enough to be notable. "I told Mrs. Morozova in October that her plan showed prideful rejection of help. I told her that God expected us to recognize our limitations. I believed that a woman alone could not survive a Montana winter, and I counseled her to accept what I assumed was inevitable failure." He paused and looked directly at Elena, who sat in the back row with the Bergstrom family. "I was wrong, not just factually wrong, but spiritually wrong. True pride is not attempting difficult things. True pride is assuming that our limited experience represents universal truth. True humility is recognizing that wisdom can come from unexpected sources and foreign traditions." The congregation was utterly silent. "God's truth does not speak only English," the Reverend continued. "And God's blessings do not flow only through channels we recognize and approve." Mrs. Morozova built a warm house. She built it with knowledge from a grandfather in Russia, knowledge that saved her life and the lives of the Bergstrom family. If that is not God's work, then I do not understand God's work at all. He stepped down from the pulpit and walked to where Elena sat. He extended his hand. "Forgive me," he said. "I should have offered help instead of judgment." Elena took his hand. "There is nothing to forgive, Reverend. You spoke from experience. I spoke from different experience. Neither of us was wrong to trust what we knew." "You were more right," he said simply. "And I will remember that the next time I am tempted to counsel someone to accept their limitations." The congregation released its held breath. Something had shifted in the room, some collective weight of judgment and fear lifting. The widow Morozova was no longer the cursed woman. She was the woman who had built the stove that saved lives. It was a different kind of reputation, and it changed everything. Josiah Harwick added a line of fire bricks to his store inventory and started keeping construction diagrams for the stoves. He had stopped suggesting that widows move to Helena. If they had skills and determination, the frontier could be survived without a husband's labor. It required different strategies, but different was not impossible. He told Elena as much when she came to pay off her credit account in March. "You proved something this winter," he said, counting out her coins and marking the ledger. "Not just about stoves, about what is possible. I proved what my grandfather knew 50 years ago. You proved it here. That is different." Josiah closed the ledger and met her eyes. "My daughter Cordelia, you remember what I told you back in October? The child came in August, a healthy girl. But Cordelia needs more than just survival now. She needs a future." What are you asking? I thought about sending her to Helena, thought about having her give up the child, thought about all the things a respectable man is supposed to think in these situations. Josiah's voice hardened with old anger and new resolution. But I watched you this winter. I watched you take something everyone said was impossible and make it work through nothing but knowledge and determination. I started thinking maybe I was asking the wrong questions about Cordelia. What questions should you be asking? Not how do I hide her shame? How do I give her tools to survive? Josiah rubbed his jaw. She is smart, my Cordelia. Smarter than her brothers were before the fever took them. I wonder if you might teach her some of what you know. Not the stove building, necessarily, but the other things. How to read plans, how to calculate materials, how to look at a problem like someone who means to solve it. Lena thought about her grandfather teaching a girl in a society that did not value girls' knowledge. She thought about the chain of learning stretching back through generations, each link forged by someone willing to teach and someone willing to learn. Send her to me, Elena said. I will teach her what I can. Cordelia Harwick arrived at Elena's cabin on a morning in early September, when the aspens were beginning to turn gold and the first hints of autumn sharpened the air. She was 17, with a month-old daughter strapped to her chest and defiant in the way that frightened people often are. My father says you can teach me things, she said. I do not know what things. I am not good at much. Elena handed her a pencil and a scrap of paper. Draw me a square. Cordelia shifted the baby and drew a square. Now divide it into 4 equal parts. Cordelia drew lines, creating 4 smaller squares. Now draw me the same square, but with channels running through it, like a maze. The path must touch every part of the square before reaching the exit. Cordelia frowned, but she bent over the paper and began drawing. Her first attempt was awkward. Her second was better. By her 5th attempt, she had created something that resembled a simple flue path. You are good at thinking spatially, Elena said. That is useful for many things. Building, planning, organizing. The world is full of problems that need people who can see solutions in their heads before they build them with their hands. I thought you were going to teach me to cook or sew. Can you not already cook and sew? Cordelia nodded reluctantly. Then I will teach you things you do not already know. In Russia, my grandfather said that a woman's hands should be able to do anything a man's hands can do. Not because she must do men's work, but because she must not be helpless when there are no men around. Something shifted in Cordelia's expression. The defiance faded, replaced by something that looked like hope. My daughter will need a mother who can survive, she said quietly. Your daughter will need a mother who can build. Build a life, build a home, build a future that does not depend on anyone else's approval or protection. Elena handed her another piece of paper. Now draw me a rectangle divided into 7 chambers connected by a single continuous path. This is how the smoke moves through a Russian stove. If you can draw it, you can begin to understand it. If you understand it, you can build it. If you build it, you can teach it. Knowledge passes through hands like heat through bricks. It only stops if everyone stops teaching. Cordelia bent over the paper and began to draw. Spring came slowly to the Gallatin Valley that year. The snow melted in stages, revealing the damage the blizzard had wrought. Collapsed outbuildings, dead livestock, damaged fences, and broken equipment. The survivors spent the months of April and May rebuilding, and Elena's stove building business was part of that reconstruction. Henrik Bergstrom was her first student and her first apprentice. His right hand still worked, though 2 fingers of his left were gone, and he threw himself into learning with the desperate energy of a man making amends. He built 3 stoves for neighbors that spring, working from Elena's designs and under her supervision. Each one worked. Each one proved the principle again. In Sweden, we have similar stoves, Henrik told Elena as they worked on the 4th installation. My grandmother had one, but I never understood how it worked. I thought it was some kind of old country magic. Magic is just knowledge we have not explained yet, Elena said. Your grandmother's stove worked for the same reasons mine works. Physics does not care about borders. Thaddeus Whitmore continued documenting the stoves as they spread through the valley. He corresponded with engineers in the East, sharing drawings and efficiency calculations. The principle behind the Russian stove was not uniquely Russian, he learned. Korean ondol heating used similar thermal mass concepts. Chinese Kang stoves combined sleeping platforms with masonry heat storage. Finnish contraflow stoves employed labyrinthine flue paths for maximum heat extraction. What these traditions share, he wrote in one of his letters, is emergence in climates where fuel is scarce and cold is deadly. They represent centuries of refinement by cultures where winter survival was not optional. American settlers have much to learn from this accumulated wisdom. Summer arrived, and with it the first anniversary of Ivan's death. Elena stood by his grave on a June morning when the wildflowers were blooming and the valley was green with new growth. She had not been able to visit during the winter, had not been able to clear the snow from his marker or leave the tokens of remembrance that custom required. Now she stood in the sunshine and spoke to him quietly. "I built your house into something they will remember," she said. "Not just for the winter, for all the winters after. Your name is not on it, but your belief is. You believed I could survive here. You were right." She placed wildflowers on the grave and stood for a long moment in silence. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had transformed into something she could carry. Not a weight, but a foundation. Not an ending, but a beginning. "I will build more," she told him. "I will teach more. And someday, maybe someone will tell the story of what we started here. They will not know your name, but they will know what we did." She walked back to the cabin with the sun on her face and the future stretching out before her like the valley itself, western and green and full of possibility. By 1876, variants of the Russian masonry heater appeared throughout Montana Territory and into Wyoming. They rarely looked identical. Each builder adapted the concept to local materials, cabin sizes, and personal understanding. Some worked better than others. Elena's original design remained the reference standard because she understood not just the construction, but the underlying principles. She had taught 23 people to build by then. Henrik Bergstrom, Cordelia Harwick, who had proven to have genuine talent for spatial reasoning and had built 2 stoves herself with her daughter watching from a basket nearby. Thaddeus Whitmore, who approached it as an engineering problem and solved it with mathematical precision. A dozen others who came seeking knowledge and left with hands that could shape warmth from brick and clay. Sven Bergstrom grew up in those years, transforming from a frightened boy who had tried to destroy Elena's work into a young man who understood why that work mattered. He helped his father build stoves. He helped Elena teach new students. He was the one who started keeping records of each installation, documenting what worked and what did not, creating a body of knowledge that would outlast them all. "Why do you record everything?" Elena asked him once. "Because you said knowledge dies if people stop teaching, but teachers die too. Records do not. If I write it down, someone 100 years from now can learn what we learned. They do not have to start from nothing." Elena looked at the young man who had grown from the boy who vandalized her bricks, at the careful drawings and precise measurements in his notebooks, at the legacy taking shape in ink and paper. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," she said. Sven looked confused. "I never knew my grandfather." "I meant my grandfather. He taught me. I taught you. That makes him your grandfather too in the ways that matter." The chain of learning stretching back through generations, each link forged by someone willing to teach, each link strengthened by someone willing to learn. Cordelia gave birth to a daughter she named Elena in August of 1874. The girl grew up surrounded by blueprints and brick samples, learning to read construction diagrams before she learned to read storybooks. She asked questions constantly, and her mother answered them with the patience of someone who remembered what it meant to be told she was not good at much. In 1892, Elena Harwick became the first woman from the Gallatin Valley to attend university. She studied engineering. Her thesis was on thermal mass heating systems in extreme climates. The dedication page contained a single line: "For the 2 Elenas who taught me that knowledge is the one thing no one can take." Of the chain of knowledge passing through hands like heat through bricks, the winter of 1876 was harsh, but fewer people died. The winter of 77 was worse, but the valley endured. The masonry heaters that Elena had introduced and others had built and improved kept families warm through blizzards, that would have been death sentences a decade earlier. The mathematics had changed. What had been impossible was now merely difficult. What had been survival was becoming prosperity. Elena sold the cabin in 1889 and moved to Bozeman to be closer to the community that had grown up around her work. She was 51 years old and had seen the valley transform from isolated homesteads to established ranches. The masonry heater she had built in 17 desperate days had warmed her home for 15 winters without significant maintenance. She fired it one last time in February of that year, during a cold snap that hit 26 degrees below zero. The ritual she had performed 1,000 times: prime the chimney, light the kindling, feed the fire, let it burn hot for 2 hours, seal the damper, wait for the bricks to do their work. By evening, with the fire long dead, the temperature inside held at 54 degrees while the valley froze outside. The same knowledge her grandfather had passed to her across an ocean in a lifetime. The same stubborn refusal to let the world decide her fate. The cabin changed hands 3 times over the next 50 years. Each owner maintained the stove because the stove worked. Each winter they fired it the way Elena had taught, the way her grandfather had taught her, the way generations of Russian Pechniki had taught their children for 400 years. In 1939, the last regular owner donated the cabin to the Montana Heritage Society. The stove was inspected and found to be structurally sound despite 70 years of use. The mortar Elena had mixed from clay and sand and grass held firm. The flue channels remained clear. The fire bricks showed wear, but no failure. It has not been fired in 70 years now. The cabin is a museum, a preserved moment from a time when survival required knowledge and determination and the willingness to learn from anyone who had answers, regardless of where they came from or what language they spoke. You can visit if you want. The rangers will show you the stove that the widow Morozova built in 17 days of desperate preparation. They will explain the physics and the history. They will tell you about the blizzard of 1874 and the 11 people who died and the 7 who survived in a 14 by 16-foot cabin heated by 4,000 pounds of brick and clay. But they cannot show you what matters most. They cannot show you the grandfather in Novgorod, teaching a girl what should have been taught to sons. They cannot show you the woman standing in a land office, receiving notice that everything she had built was being taken away. They cannot show you the moment she decided to build anyway. They cannot show you the fear she felt that first night in the cabin, or the determination that carried her through 17 days of work, or the relief when the smoke finally rose through the channels and the bricks grew warm. They cannot show you the door opening on the 6th night of the blizzard, when a woman who had called her cursed stood begging for shelter. They cannot show you the choice to help anyway. That is what the stove cannot preserve. The human moments that made the technical achievement possible. The courage and fear and stubbornness and grace that shaped brick into survival. But you can imagine it. Stand in that cabin, in the silence of a museum that was once a home. Put your hand on the bricks that Elena shaped from creek clay 150 years ago. They are cool now, have been cool for decades. But they remember heat. They remember survival. They remember what happens when knowledge crosses borders and someone pays attention. The frontier is gone, but the principle remains. When conventional wisdom says something cannot be done, maybe you are just asking the wrong people. Somewhere, someone has already solved your problem. You just need to know where to look and be humble enough to learn from them. Elena Morozova looked to Novgorod when Montana said she would freeze. The answer was always there. She just had to build it. If this story has meant something to you, I want to thank you for staying until the end. Stories like Elena's deserve to be remembered, not as quaint historical curiosities, but as reminders that knowledge and determination can overcome obstacles that seem impossible. The frontier was ruthless in its honesty. Bad ideas failed visibly. Good ideas survived and spread. That kind of honesty is rare now, but it is worth preserving. If you want to help keep these stories alive, please subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who might need to hear that impossible is just another word for not yet figured out. Elena's grandfather could never have imagined Montana, but his knowledge traveled there anyway, carried by a granddaughter he had trusted with his life's work. And that knowledge saved lives in a language and landscape he never knew. That is the power of teaching. That is the power of learning. That is the chain that connects us all across borders and generations and oceans of time. Build something worth passing on. Someone you will never meet might need it someday.
Elena Morozova's story proves that knowledge is the only wealth no one can steal. Facing isolation and a deadly winter, she used her heritage to build what others deemed impossible. Her Russian stove did more than defy the cold. It warmed the hearts of those who shunned her. By saving the neighbors who called her cursed, Elena proved that competence and kindness are the ultimate answers to prejudice. When the world says something is impossible, look to your roots. The solution might already exist, waiting for you to build it.